Hashtag fighting beside humans, the day I realized what true horror in war really means. Hashtag Part 1. Veilkith had fought in 11 wars. He had walked across burned planets and stood in the middle of battlefields where the air smelled like metal and smoke. He had watched armies break and fall and disappear. He had seen things that most soldiers never see. And in all those years, across all those campaigns, he had never once been confused by war. War, to the Swordhani, was simple. It was math. You counted your forces, counted the enemy, measured the ground, and made a decision. You pushed forward when the numbers said push. You pulled back when the numbers said pull. You did not feel your way through a battle. You calculated your way through it. Emotion was a weakness. Hesitation was a failure of logic. The Swordhani were not cruel, they simply did not allow feelings to sit at the same table as strategy. That was why, when Veilkith received his new assignment, his first reaction was not fear or excitement. It was confusion of a different kind. He read the orders 3 times. Then he sat very still and read them a 4th time. He was being sent to embed with a human unit. The war against the Kreth Dominion had been grinding on for 6 years. The Kreth were powerful, disciplined, and patient. They did not make many mistakes. But the ceasefire had fallen apart 2 months ago, and now both the Swordhani and the humans needed each other in ways that made pride inconvenient. High Command had decided that the two forces would begin operating together. Veilkith, as a senior field observer, was chosen to go first. He was to join the 9th Rapid Response Battalion of the United Earth Forces, travel with them, observe them, and report back everything he learned. He packed his equipment carefully. He reviewed everything the Swordhani intelligence files had on human soldiers. The files were thorough. They covered physical capability, average reaction time, known tactical formations, weapons systems, medical vulnerabilities. Veilkith read all of it. He felt reasonably prepared. He was not prepared at all. He arrived aboard the UES Cradle of Iron on a Tuesday, which he later learned was a day humans considered slightly worse than other days for reasons that were never clearly explained to him. The ship was large, loud, and smelled like cooked food and engine oil. There were humans everywhere, moving in groups, talking over each other, laughing at things he could not identify as funny. 2 soldiers were arguing loudly near the docking bay entrance about whether a particular food item back home was supposed to be eaten hot or cold. Neither of them seemed to think this argument was unusual. Veilkith stood still for a moment and simply observed. His field log was already open in his hand. He was met by Captain Leon Hart, the commanding officer of the 9th Battalion. Hart was a lean man from a place called Tennessee, which Veilkith had looked up before arriving. He had brown eyes that were calm in a way that felt deliberate rather than natural, like a man who had decided to be calm a long time ago and had never changed his mind. He shook Veilkith's hand, a human greeting gesture that Veilkith accepted without fully understanding, and spoke in a voice that was quiet and even. "Glad to have you," Hart said. "We'll get you set up. You eat." Veilkith said that he did, in fact, consume nutrition. Hart almost smiled. "Come on then." The mess hall was where Veilkith first began to understand that something was deeply unusual about these creatures. The 9th Battalion was scheduled for a combat drop in 31 hours. This was not a secret, everyone on the ship knew. And yet the soldiers in the mess hall were eating noisily, joking, stealing food off each other's plates, and debating topics that had absolutely nothing to do with the upcoming operation. A young soldier named Private Calvin Moss, barely 20 years old and from a place called Colorado, was doing an impression of someone that made the whole table laugh so hard one man had to put his fork down. Another soldier knocked over a cup of something and swore loudly, which made everyone laugh harder. Veilkith sat at the end of the table with his own food and watched this. He was introduced to the unit's medic, Corporal Dana Wolf. She was a young woman from Oregon with red hair that she kept tied back and a habit of humming quietly while she worked. She looked at Veilkith with open curiosity rather than discomfort, which he found unusual. Most non-Sorthani species were at least mildly uneasy around his kind. Dana simply said, "You've got good eyes." "I like that," and went back to eating. He met Sergeant Roy Carver, the unit's heavy weapons specialist. Carver was a very large man from a place called Georgia, with a laugh that could probably be heard from 2 corridors away. He ate an enormous amount of food. He talked a great deal. He had a name tattooed on his left forearm, Old Persistence, and when Vale Kith asked about it, Carver grinned and said that was the name of his rotary cannon. Vale Kith wrote in his field log, "The heavy weapons specialist has named his weapon." I do not know what to do with this information. Over the following hours, Vale Kith followed the unit and observed. He attended their pre-mission briefing, which Hart ran with a completely different energy than the mess hall, precise, focused, no wasted words. The soldiers listened without interrupting. They asked sharp questions. For a short time, in that room, Vale Kith could almost recognize something familiar in them. They sounded like soldiers. Then the briefing ended and Carver said, "All right, who owes me from last week's card game?" And the noise started again. That night Vale Kith sat alone in his assigned quarters and tried to organize his observations. He had expected human soldiers to be rough and simple, capable fighters, but straightforward. What he was finding instead was something harder to categorize. These people were layered in a way that made no immediate sense to him. They were loud and they were focused. They were reckless with their laughter and careful with their weapons. They joked about death the way others might joke about the weather, casually, without weight, and yet when Hart had spoken during the briefing about the 2 soldiers they'd lost in the last operation, the whole room had gone very quiet in a way that felt heavy and real. They were not simple. That was what he kept coming back to. He had expected simple. He walked the ship again late that night because he could not sleep. Sword Honey rarely needed much sleep, and the ship's constant low hum was different from what he was used to. He passed through a corridor and found Hart standing at a small porthole, looking out at the stars. The captain had a cup of something warm in his hand and was completely still. Vale Kith slowed without meaning to. Hart did not look away from the window. He just said, "Can't sleep either." "I do not require much sleep," Vale Kith said. Hart nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "They're good people. My unit. I know they seem a lot. But they're good." Vale Kith did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Hart looked at him then, just briefly, and there was something in his eyes that was very difficult to read. Not grief exactly. Not worry. Something older than both. Then he drank from his cup and said, "Get some rest. Drops in 26 hours," and walked away down the corridor. Vale Kith stood at the porthole for a while after that. He wrote his last log entry for the night before returning to his quarters. He tried to be analytical about it. He listed observations. He noted behavioral patterns. He recorded names and roles and the strange habit humans had of filling silence with noise. At the very end, almost without deciding to, he wrote one more line. "I do not yet understand these soldiers. But I am beginning to think that understanding them will be harder than I expected. And perhaps more important." He closed the log and looked out at the stars for a moment longer. In 26 hours, he would find out what they were really made of. #fighting beside humans, the day I realized what true horror in war really means. ## Part 2. The shuttle dropped hard through the clouds of Dravath 4 and nobody stopped talking until the first explosion. Vale Kith was sitting near the rear of the descent craft, strapped into a jump seat between 2 soldiers he had not yet fully learned the names of. The inside of the shuttle smelled like armor polish and recycled air. Outside, through the small reinforced window near his position, the moon's surface was a flat gray-brown color, covered in low rock formations and the distant dark shapes of prefabricated structures. The Kreth supply depot was somewhere in the middle of those shapes. The mission was straightforward: move in fast, hit the depot, take what intelligence assets they could grab, destroy the rest, get out. Vale Kith had reviewed the plan twice. It was simple and clean. Captain Hart had run through it again during the final hour before drop. The soldiers had listened, nodded, asked their questions. Private Calvin Moss had asked if the ration quality would improve once they disrupted Kreth supply lines. Sergeant Carver had told him to shut up and eat his current rations while he still had them. Everyone had laughed. Now they were falling through the sky, and Calvin Moss was humming something quietly to himself, and Sergeant Carver had one hand resting on Old Persistence like he was steadying a nervous dog, and Corporal Dana Wolf was going through her medical kit one last time with the calm, quick hands of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. The shuttle hit the ground and the door came open and the soldiers moved. For the first 4 minutes, everything went exactly as planned. Then it didn't. The first sign was the silence where there should not have been silence. Valkith noticed it before the shooting started, a particular absence of movement around the depot's outer structures that was wrong in a way he recognized from long experience. Things were too still. Positions that should have had Kreth patrol activity showed nothing. His hand was already moving toward his communicator when the first volley came from the left, then the right, then from above the depot's raised platform on the eastern side. It was a trap. The depot was bait. The Kreth had been waiting. In the Swordhani military, the correct response to a confirmed trap was immediate and non-negotiable. You called it, you confirmed it, and you began a staged withdrawal while requesting fire support. There was no shame in it. The logic was clean: a force that retreats intact can fight again, and a force that stays in a trap becomes part of the trap. Valkith's hand was still moving toward his communicator and his mind was already composing the withdrawal request when he realized that the humans had not slowed down at all. They had gotten faster. It was the thing he had not expected and could not have prepared for. The laughter was gone completely. There was no trace of it now, no noise that was not tactical, no movement that was not purposeful. But there was no panic either. No hesitation. What replaced the easy loudness of the mess hall was something entirely different, something quieter and colder and far more focused, and it moved through the unit like a current that had always been there, just waiting to be switched on. Hart's voice came over the unit channel, flat and steady, calling positions and vectors like he was reading a list. There was no urgency in it. That was the part that caught Valkith off guard, not the calmness exactly, but the specific quality of it. It was the calm of someone who had already accepted every possible outcome and was simply working through them one at a time. Carver moved to a broken stone formation on the right side of the approach path and set up old persistence without being told to. He was bleeding above his left eye from a fragment hit he had taken in the first 10 seconds. He had not mentioned it and did not appear to notice it. He opened fire on the elevated eastern platform and the volume of fire from that direction dropped by half. Valkith stood in the cover of the shuttle's landing struts and watched because he genuinely did not know what else to do. His withdrawal logic was still running in the back of his mind, but the humans were not withdrawing, and following them suddenly seemed more reasonable than leaving. Then he saw Dana Wolf. Private Aaron Gibbs had gone down in the open ground between the shuttle and the depot's outer wall, a stretch of maybe 30 meters with no cover, bad angle, ongoing fire from 2 directions. Gibbs was moving but not standing, which meant wounded but alive, which in Swordhani tactical doctrine meant you noted his position and came back for him when the situation allowed. You did not go out into 30 meters of open ground under active fire for one soldier. Dana went out anyway. She moved fast and low and she did not look like someone performing an act of sacrifice. She looked like someone doing a job that needed doing. She reached Gibbs, got her arm under him, and started pulling him back. Valkith watched a Kreth energy round hit the ground less than 2 meters from her left boot and kick up a spray of rock. She did not change her speed or direction. Halfway back, another round caught her in the shoulder, not a full hit, a graze, but enough to see, and she stumbled half a step and kept moving. She got Gibbs back to cover. She checked his wound. She pressed a seal pack onto the injury with her good arm, the other one hanging slightly lower than it should. Then she looked up and called Gibbs's status to Hart over the channel. She did not mention her own shoulder. Valkith became aware that he had not moved in approximately 40 seconds, which was long enough to be a problem. He forced himself back into motion. The situation became clear over the next several minutes. 2 members of the unit, Private Lena Cruz and Specialist Doug Farr, had been cut off on the far side of the depot when the Kreth closed the trap. They were alive and in contact but could not move back through the fire corridor on their own. The extraction window was closing. Valkith reached for his communicator again. Hart's hand came down over it, gently but firmly, without the captain even looking at him. He was watching the depot layout on a small display in his other hand. "Not yet," Hart said. "We still have people up there. The tactical situation does not favor." "We still have people up there," Hart said again. His voice was not angry. It was simply the same. Like it was not something that could be argued with because it was not an opinion. It was just a fact about how things were going to go. They went in to get Cruz and Farr. Veilkith went with them, partly because leaving felt suddenly wrong in a way he could not immediately explain. What followed was 20 minutes of the most concentrated close-range combat Veilkith had experienced in a very long time. The humans moved through it with a focused, grinding consistency that wore the Kreth position down piece by piece. Carver kept the eastern platform suppressed. Moss moved ammunition to positions that needed it, running routes that should have been suicidal and completing them every time with the slightly wild energy of someone who had decided not to think too hard about the math. They found Cruz and Farr sheltered behind a collapsed equipment housing near the depot's north side. Cruz had a cut across her jaw and Farr had lost his helmet somewhere and had a look on his face like a man who had recently reconsidered several life choices. They both stood up immediately when Hart arrived. The extraction took 11 more minutes. Every human that had gone in came out. The shuttle lifted off the surface of Dravath 4 with all personnel aboard. The depot behind them was burning. Veilkith sat in his jump seat and looked at the people around him. Dana Wolf was finally allowing someone to look at her shoulder. She had a deep graze burn across the top of it, and she was telling the soldier treating it to stop making such a face about it. Carver was cleaning the barrel of Old Persistence and quietly singing something to himself. Calvin Moss had gone back to humming. Hart sat at the front of the shuttle and looked at his display. Veilkith opened his field log. He sat with it open in his hands for a long moment without writing anything. Then he wrote, "I have fought in 11 campaigns. In every one of them, I understood the soldiers I was with. I understood how they thought and why they moved and what they would do when things went wrong. I understood them because they calculated, as I calculate. Today I watched something that I do not have a category for. These humans walked into a confirmed trap and they did not compute the loss threshold. They did not run the withdrawal logic. They saw people they knew in danger and something inside them simply decided that the numbers did not apply. I do not yet know what to call that. I am not sure it has a name in any language I speak." He paused. Then he wrote one more line. "I did not leave. That is also something I will need to think about. #fighting beside humans, the day I realized what true horror in war really means." Part 3. 3 weeks passed between deployments, and Veilkith spent most of them watching. The UES Cradle of Iron was a large ship but not an empty one. It had corridors that smelled like food at specific hours and engine oil at all other hours. It had a mess hall that was loud from breakfast until late at night. It had a small gym where soldiers pushed their bodies past comfortable limits for reasons that were not always tactical. It had dark corners and bright corridors and a handful of observation windows where the stars looked cold and far away. Veilkith moved through all of it. He attended briefings he was not required to attend. He sat in on maintenance checks for equipment that was not his. He ate meals in the mess hall at the hours when the 9th Battalion ate, even when he did not need to eat. He was, in the language of his own people, conducting a field observation. But if he was honest with himself, and Veilkith had always tried to be honest, it was becoming something more than that. He was trying to understand them. Not tactically. Actually understand them. The first real conversation happened with Dana Wolf. Her shoulder had healed faster than expected. She had been cleared for light duty within a week, full duty within 10 days, which she had pushed for aggressively despite the medical officer's preference for 12. She was in the medical bay recataloguing supply stocks on an otherwise quiet afternoon when Veilkith walked past and she called out to him by name, which he had not yet fully gotten used to. He sat across from her while she worked. She talked as she sorted supplies, which seemed to be a natural state for her, hands busy, mouth moving, neither thing interfering with the other. He asked her, carefully, why she had become a medic. She was quiet for a moment. Then she told him. She had a younger brother. His name had been Pete. He was killed in the first wave of the Kreth border conflict, 6 years ago, during an engagement where a faster medical response would likely have saved him. The wound was not immediately fatal. The help simply did not arrive in time. She said all of this plainly. Her hands did not stop moving. She did not look at the wall and go distant the way Veilkith had seen other creatures do when speaking of loss. She looked at the supply containers and kept counting. That's why, she said. So other people's brothers have a better chance. Veilkith did not know what to say, so he simply nodded. She glanced at him briefly. You have family back on your world. He told her that the Swordhani did not structure family the same way humans did. He told her about the Swordhani way, collective units, shared purpose, very little of what humans would call personal attachment. She considered this seriously. That sounds lonely, she said. He had never thought of it that way before. He found, sitting in the medical bay, that he still was not certain she was wrong. The conversation with Sergeant Carver came 2 days later, over a meal that Carver had somehow made larger than the standard portions. Valekith had asked the question that had been sitting in his notes since the first day, the name on Carver's forearm. Old Persistence. The same name he gave his cannon. Carver looked at his arm and then looked at Valekith, and for a moment his usual large easy energy went somewhere quieter. It's a reminder, Carver said. When you name something, you know what it is. Some guys out here start thinking of their weapons as just tools, you know. Just a thing in their hands. And when it starts feeling like just a thing, you stop thinking about what it does. You stop thinking about the weight of it. He turned the cannon's grip over in his large hands. I don't want to stop thinking about the weight of it. So I gave it a name. Means every time I pick it up, I have to look at that name and remember exactly what I'm holding and exactly what it's for. Valekith wrote that down word for word that night. He was not sure why it affected him as much as it did. The Swordhani had disciplines for managing the emotional weight of combat. They were called recalibrations. They were formal, structured, efficient. They did not involve naming things. But there was something in Carver's logic, this enormous loudman from Georgia who laughed too much and ate too much and held his cannon like it mattered, that felt more real to him than recalibration had ever felt. He spent an evening watching the soldiers in the gym. Moss was lifting weights while Lena Cruz spotted him and told him he was going to hurt himself. Far was running on a track, headphones on, completely elsewhere. 2 soldiers he had not yet learned the names of were stretching in a corner, talking about food again. He watched Cruz and Moss for a while. Cruz was small and quick and had a scar on her chin from the depot raid that she had not tried to hide. Moss was young, the youngest in the unit, Valekith had gathered, and had the kind of easy fearlessness that either came from experience or from not yet fully understanding the alternatives. Valekith had not yet decided which it was with Moss. He thought about that. He thought about the way Moss had run ammunition on Dravath 4, out in the open, route after route. He thought about whether Moss was brave or simply young enough not to be afraid. And then he thought, is there a difference? And more importantly, does the difference matter, when the ammunition gets where it needs to go? The hardest person to understand was Captain Hart. Hart spoke less than anyone else in the unit. He was never unfriendly, but there was a distance in him that was different from coldness, more like someone who kept one part of themselves in a room that not many people were invited into. He ran his unit well, thought clearly, made decisions without wasted motion. Valekith respected him in the way that any soldier respects a commanding officer who is genuinely good at their work. But Valekith found him one night at the observation window, the same one from the first night, with the same cup of something warm. This time Valekith stopped and stayed. They stood there for a while without speaking. Then Hart said he had been fighting for 9 years. He said it without drama. Just a fact. He talked about a colony called Callaway Station. It had been a human settlement in the Outer Rim, a working place, not a large one, full of ordinary people doing ordinary things. The Kreth had glassed it in the early months of the war. Burned it from orbit. There was no military value in it. It was simply a statement. His wife had grown up there. She had been visiting family when it happened. She got to an evacuation ship with 11 minutes to spare. Her parents did not. Hart said this while looking at the stars. His voice did not shake. His face did not change. He was not telling the story for sympathy, Valekith understood that clearly. He was telling it because Valekith was standing next to him and the night was quiet and it was simply true. I've been fighting since then, Hart said. I don't plan on stopping. Valekith stood beside him and felt something shift in his chest in a way he did not entirely have a name for. He wrote in his log that night for a long time. He wrote about Dana Wolf and her brother Pete. He wrote about Carver and the name tattooed on his arm. He wrote about Moss running routes that should not have worked. He wrote about Hart at the window. Near the end of the entry, he stopped trying to analyze and simply wrote what he thought. The Swordhani go to war because the calculations demand it. We are sent, and we go, and we do what is required, and we come back and we are recalibrated and we go again. There is no shame in it. It is how we survive. But these humans, they do not go to war because calculations demand it. They go because something happened that they cannot forgive, or something exists that they cannot leave unprotected, or someone they love is in danger and the only direction that makes sense is toward that danger. They carry their reasons with them into every fight, every single time. It does not make them reckless. It makes them something I do not have a word for. He looked at the words for a moment. New deployment orders have arrived. A Kreth armored column is moving on Port Aldrich. 40,000 civilians. We are going in. All of us. He closed the log and lay down and looked at the ceiling of his quarters. He thought about Dana's brother. He thought about Callaway Station. He thought about a name tattooed on a large man's arm. He thought about what it would mean to carry all of that into a fight with 40,000 lives on the other end of it. He did not sleep, but not because of the ship's hum this time. #fighting beside humans, the day I realized what true horror in war really means. Part 4. Port Aldrich was a quiet colony on a planet that had not asked for any of this. It sat on a wide plain between two low mountain ranges, its buildings modest and practical: grain processors, water refineries, housing blocks, a small school, a medical center that served the surrounding farmlands. The people who lived there had come from different parts of Earth to build something ordinary. 40,000 of them, give or take, going about their ordinary lives until the Kreth decided that ordinary lives were a useful thing to destroy. Valkith had read the intelligence assessment on the shuttle ride down. The Kreth armored column was not moving on Port Aldrich for strategic value. There was nothing at Port Aldrich that the Kreth needed. The colony was being targeted because it was human, because it was visible, and because destroying it would send a message that the Kreth wanted sent. It was not war in the way Valkith understood war. It was something uglier: punishment for existing. The 9th Battalion landed at the colony's northern perimeter as the first Kreth advance units were already visible on the far edge of the plain. Evacuation had been underway for 11 hours, but it was not finished. The lower districts of the colony, the older housing blocks, the areas furthest from the evacuation port, still had people in them. Families who had not gotten the order in time. People who could not move fast. People who had not believed it would actually come. 3 human battalions were deployed to hold the defensive line. The Swordhani support units, including Valkith's assigned squad of 6, were placed on the eastern flank. Standard deployment. Standard positioning. For the first 2 hours, the line held. Then the Kreth column split. A secondary force, larger than the intelligence estimate had projected, swung wide around the colony's southern edge and hit the western flank hard. The Swordhani units on the western side took heavy casualties fast. Valkith watched the battle display on his communicator as the western position started to collapse. He heard the calls going over the shared channel: urgent, controlled, fading. The Swordhani western commander did what doctrine demanded. He called the threshold, confirmed the loss rate, and ordered a staged withdrawal. It was the correct decision by every measure Valkith had ever been trained to apply. Preserve the force. Live to fight again. The math was clear. Valkith watched the blue markers on his display begin to pull back. He opened the channel to his own squad. 6 soldiers, Swordhani, trained, reliable. He brought up the withdrawal coordinates. His mouth opened to issue the order. He looked up. The 9th Battalion's position was on his left. He could see it from where he stood, the ruins of a grain storage facility that Hart had turned into a defensive anchor. Smoke was rising from 3 places along the line. The channel was full of Hart's voice, still flat, still steady, still calling positions and corrections as if the collapsing western flank was simply a new variable to solve for rather than a reason to leave. Carver was at the crossroads 30 meters from the storage facility. He had set Old Persistence in the center of the road and was holding a full kill corridor against an advancing Kreth armored element on his own. The cannon was firing in steady controlled bursts. Carver's face was completely blank, not afraid, not excited, just working. A small fire had started somewhere near his left boot from a secondary detonation and he had not moved away from it. He had simply kicked dirt onto it without stopping the burst pattern. Dana Wolf had turned a collapsed building on the south side of the position into a trauma station. Valkith could see her moving inside it, crouched over a soldier, working fast. She had no cover above her. Rounds were hitting the outside of what remained of the building's walls every few minutes. She did not look up when they hit. She kept working. Calvin Moss was running. That was the only word for it. He was moving between positions with ammunition containers, finding routes through rubble and smoke that looked impossible and using them anyway. He ran, he delivered, he turned around and ran again. Valkith watched him complete 4 runs in the time it took the withdrawal coordinates to fully load on his display. On the 5th run, a Kreth energy round hit the ground close enough to throw Moss sideways off his feet. He was up again in 3 seconds, container still in his hands, still moving. Valkith stood very still. Then he saw Lena Cruz. She was at the eastern edge of the position, near a narrow road that ran down into the lower district. She was not supposed to be there, that area was outside the defensive perimeter, it was not her sector, the numbers said it was already too late for anyone down there. But movement had caught her attention and she had gone to look, and what she had found was a small girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old, who had gotten separated from her family in the evacuation and had wandered back the wrong way into the wrong part of a battle. Cruz picked the child up without hesitating. She moved back toward the line. A Kreth artillery shell hit the road 30 meters behind her and the pressure wave knocked her forward and she went down on one knee, child still in her arms. She got up. She made it back to the position and put the child behind a barrier wall and crouched over her when the next shell hit. Valkith looked at his communicator. The withdrawal coordinates were loaded. His squad was ready. He thought about Sorthani doctrine. He thought about preserved forces and calculated thresholds and living to fight another day. He thought about the math, which was clear and correct and pointed in one direction. Then he closed the withdrawal coordinates. He opened the squad channel and said, "Eastern approach. We hold." His squad was quiet for exactly 1 second. Then they moved into position. What followed was 4 hours that Valkith would think about for the rest of his life. The Sorthani squad held the eastern approach with the 9th Battalion through the worst of the Kreth push. It was not elegant. It was not calculated. It was grinding and loud and painful, and twice it came close to collapsing, and both times it did not because Hart found a way and Carver held a position and Dana Wolf kept soldiers functional who should have been out of the fight. The reinforcements arrived in the 4th hour. The Kreth column broke. The western flank reformed. The evacuation of Port Aldrich completed in the final minutes before the column could reform for a second push. 40,000 people got out. When the firing stopped, the colony was half destroyed and the plain around it was covered in smoke. The 9th Battalion gathered in the ruins of the grain storage facility that had been their anchor point. They were dirty and burned and bleeding in different places and very quiet. Carver sat on a piece of rubble near Old Persistence and cleaned the barrel in silence. Dana Wolf was finally allowing someone to look at the new burns on her hands, though she was telling the soldier treating them that they looked worse than they were. Lena Cruz was sitting against a wall with her eyes closed and her face turned up toward the open sky. Doug Farr sat beside her and didn't say anything, which seemed to be exactly right. Hart sat on the ground with his back against what was left of a wall, his broken arm resting in his lap. He had not reported it during the fighting and it had not slowed him down, and when someone finally noticed and said something, he simply nodded and said he'd have it seen too. His eyes were closed. Calvin Moss was not there. He had been killed in the last hour of the siege. The 5th run, or the 6th, someone would have to check the record later. He had been 20 years old and from Colorado and he had laughed in the mess hall about rations and the ammunition had gotten where it needed to go and he had not made it back. Nobody said anything for a long time. Someone lit a small fire in the middle of the group. It had no tactical purpose. It gave no real warmth. It was simply a fire, and people sat around it, and after a while Dana Wolf began to hum her quiet song, and the sound of it moved through the smoke and the silence like something that had no right to be as steady as it was. Valkith sat at the edge of the group and watched them. He did not feel separate from them. That was new. He did not open his field log that night. He just sat with the fire and the smoke and the people who were still there. He sat there for a long time. When he finally wrote, much later, he did not write about tactics or thresholds or doctrine. He wrote about what true horror in war really meant. Not the weapons. Not the dying. Not the fire or the smoke or the broken buildings. The horror was this, that these people knew all of it. They had always known. They knew the cost before they paid it, and they paid it anyway, not because they had no choice, but because they had looked at what was on the other side of the cost and decided it was worth it. They carried that knowledge into every single fight, every single time, and it did not stop them. It was the thing that moved them forward. Veilkith did not know if that was the bravest thing he had ever seen or the most terrible. He was beginning to think it was both at the same time. #fighting beside humans, the day I realized what true horror in war really means. Part 5. The chambers of the Sordhani High Command were built to make people feel small. That was not an accident. The Sordhani had designed the space deliberately: high ceilings, pale stone walls, very little light except what came from the long windows facing the capital's skyline. The seats of the 7 senior commanders were elevated on a curved platform, so that whoever stood below them had to look up. It was a room that said, without using any words, "You are here to report, not to be heard." Veilkith had stood in this room 3 times before, after previous campaigns. He had always found it comfortable. Appropriate. He had delivered his reports precisely and returned to his post without difficulty. This time he stood in the center of the floor and looked up at the 7 faces above him and felt, for the first time, that the room's design was a problem. Commander Selvar, the eldest of the 7, spoke first. He was a careful, slow-voiced man who had run the Sordhani military with quiet efficiency for longer than most soldiers in the field could remember. He asked Veilkith to begin. Veilkith had his field log with him. He had his data. He had the formal report, prepared, organized, cross-referenced with tactical assessments and force efficiency ratings and all the things the High Command would expect. He set the formal report on the floor beside his feet. He looked up at the 7 commanders. And then he told them what he had actually seen. He told them about the mess hall on the Cradle of Iron. He told them about 31 hours before a combat drop, and soldiers arguing about food, and a young man from Colorado doing impressions that made the whole table laugh. He told them it had confused him. He told them he had written in his log that he did not understand what he was looking at, and that he had been right, he had not understood it, not yet. He told them about Dravath 4. He told them about a confirmed trap, and the moment he had reached for his communicator to call withdrawal, and the hand that had come down over it. He told them about Dana Wolf crossing 30 meters of open ground under active fire to reach a wounded soldier, taking a hit and continuing, and never mentioning it over the channel. He told them about Sergeant Carver bleeding above his eye and holding a suppression position and singing to himself. He saw 2 of the commanders exchange a glance. They thought he was building to a tactical point. They were waiting for the analysis. He kept talking. He told them about the conversations. About Dana and her brother Pete, and the plain way she had said it, and her hands not stopping while she told the story. About Carver's cannon and the name on his arm and the reason he had given for it, the weight of the thing, and the deliberate choice to keep feeling that weight. About Captain Hart at the observation window, 9 years of war in his face, talking about a colony that no longer existed and a decision that had apparently been made a long time ago and never revisited. The chamber was very quiet now. Veilkith told them about Port Aldrich. He told them about the western flank collapsing and the Sordhani units withdrawing and the withdrawal coordinates loaded on his communicator. He told them he had been correct to load them. He told them the math was sound and the doctrine was right and every calculation he had ever been trained to make said to leave. Then he told them what he had seen instead. Cruz and the child. Moss running. Wolf working in a building with no roof while rounds hit the walls. Hart calling positions in the voice of a man who had decided, somewhere long before this particular battle, that there was no version of events in which he stopped. He told them he had cancelled the withdrawal order. Selvar leaned forward slightly. On what grounds? Veilkith looked at him. On the grounds, he said, that I finally understood what I was looking at. He paused for a moment, choosing his words. I have fought beside many species, he said. I have fought beside the Turhai, who are faster than us and more aggressive. I have fought beside the Dulwone, who have better natural armor and stronger group instincts. In every case, I understood them because they operated from the same basic framework that we do. They calculated. They optimized. They had a point at which the math said stop, and they stopped. The chamber was completely still. The humans do not have that point. That is what I am trying to tell you. They can be killed. They can be worn down. Individual humans have limits like any creature. But as a force, as a thing moving through a war, they do not operate on a loss threshold the way we understand it. Because their reason for fighting is not a calculation. It is something they carry inside them that does not respond to numbers. He thought of Hart at the window. He thought of Dana's hands not stopping. The Kreth have known this, he said. They have studied humans for years. They know the numbers. They have run every calculation. And they are still losing. Because there is one variable they cannot account for, and I could not account for it either, until I stood beside these people on the ground at Port Aldrich. He let the silence sit for a moment. When you destroy something a human loves, a home, a person, a place, you do not weaken them. You remove the last reason they had to hold back. The Kreth glassed Callaway Station to send a message. They have been burning human colonies to send messages for 6 years. And every time they do, they create 10,000 more Captain Harts. 10,000 more people with 9 years of war in their faces and a very simple idea about how long they intend to keep going. The Kreth have spent this entire war making humans angry, Valkith said. I watched what angry humans look like from the inside. I watched them hold a line they had no tactical reason to hold, because 40,000 civilians had not yet finished leaving, and the only calculation that mattered to them was whether those civilians were safe. He picked up his formal report from the floor. He held it for a moment, then set it on the edge of the platform below the commanders. The data is there, if you want it. Force ratings, efficiency assessments, tactical recommendations. It is all accurate. But it is not the most important thing I can tell you. Selvar looked at him with the particular expression of a man who was thinking more carefully than his face was showing. Then tell us the most important thing, Selvar said. Valkith looked at all 7 of them. Honor this alliance with everything we have, he said. Not because humans are useful. Not because they fill a capability gap in our formations or extend our tactical reach. Because in 10,000 years of Swordhani history, we have never fought beside anything like them. And the choice of whether they are beside us or across from us is one that we should make very carefully, and we should make it right. He stopped. The chamber was silent for a long time. Selvar sat back. He looked at the other commanders. Whatever passed between them in that look was not something Valkith could fully read. Then the old commander nodded, very slightly, and said, "We will consider your report." Valkith was dismissed. He walked out of the chambers and down the long pale corridor and out into the open air of Soreth Prime's capital. The sky was the color it always was, deep amber at the horizon, darker above. It was a sky he had grown up under. It had always felt like home. He stood there for a moment. He thought about a small fire in the ruins of Port Aldrich. He thought about people sitting around it in the dark, not talking, just there. He thought about a quiet humming moving through the smoke. He had already filed the second request before leaving the ship. A permanent embed with the 9th Rapid Response Battalion. He had not told anyone, not Hart, not Carver, not Dana. He had simply filed it and waited. The approval had come through that morning. He had a shuttle back to the front leaving in 4 hours. He sat on a bench outside the High Command building and opened his field log for the last time before departure. He had been writing in it since before the Cradle of Iron, before Dravath 4, before 3 weeks of watching people carry their reasons into everything they did. It was full now, more full than any previous campaign log. He looked at the last page. He wrote, "I used to believe that the greatest soldiers were those who felt nothing. I believed that feeling was a variable that corrupted outcomes. I was trained to believe this and I believed it completely, without question, for a very long time. I am not certain that belief was wrong for what I was. But I have since seen what it looks like when soldiers feel everything, when they carry every reason and every loss and every quiet promise made at a hospital bed or a window looking at stars, and fight anyway. Not past it. Not despite it. Because of it. I do not know if I can fully become that. I am not sure I was built for it. But I know this: I will stand beside them tomorrow, and the day after, and as long as there is something worth standing beside. And I find, on reflection, that I am not doing it because my orders say to. I am doing it because I want to. That is new. That is something I did not have before. He closed the log. He picked up his pack and walked toward the shuttle port. The amber sky was bright above Sorith Prime. Somewhere far out past the stars, 40,000 people were living ordinary lives in a rebuilt colony because a line had held. He walked, and he did not look back.